Hello, and welcome to the Collab365 Summit. I'm super excited to be here today to talk to you about how to create user-friendly and engaging SharePoint sites. And you can do it all without writing any code. My name is Wendy Neal, and I'm currently a .NET SharePoint developer for DMI out of Bethesda, Maryland. I live in the Iowa City, Iowa area. I work from home out of my home office doing SharePoint development for one of DMI's government clients. You can find me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of those. My website, wendy-neal.com. And I'm also a contributing author for a few online websites and publications. And here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start off with some usability best practices, just some tips, kind of an overview, basic things you might already know, but it's always a good refresher. Next, we'll talk about some of the common usability issues that you run into with the out-of-the-box SharePoint user interface. And luckily, most of those are easily remedied with just some quick and easy changes. Third, we'll talk about some of the top usability tips that we're going to apply. We'll take a real-world example and apply some of these tips and tricks to make the site a little bit more user-friendly and more engaging. And then lastly, of course, I'll show a demo. You'll see the site before and after, and then you can be the judge on which one is more user-friendly. Usability best practices. Rule number one, don't make me think. That's the name of one of my very favorite books on usability out there, written by Steve Krug. And according to him, all websites should be self-evident, obvious, self-explanatory, shouldn't cause your users confusion. They shouldn't have to think. Anything that makes them think is going to add to their frustration level, and over time, these little things that cause frustration or make users think is going to add up. It's a cumulative effect, and it's just going to be very frustrating for your users. So this is a real good, easy, light read. It's humorous. It's not a lot of boring usability theory. It's just common sense things that once you read, you'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or I knew that, but just thinking about it in a different way, it kind of becomes more obvious. So great book, highly recommend it. So some of the things that I want to pick out of that book, I want to mention navigation and some of the best practices around navigation. Your navigation should be concise and consistent, and we're talking about the primary navigation. It's usually at the top of the page, horizontal across the top. That's where it is in the default SharePoint out-of-the-box interface. However, it could be, along the left-hand nav as a vertical links, but the most common location for it would be at the top of the page. Those primary nav links should be identical no matter where you're at on the site. So if you're on a site or sub-site, 4 levels deep, it doesn't matter where you are. You should always see those same navigation links up at the top. Kind of gives you your bearing of where you're at in a site, and also how you can get to any place else you want to go. You also want to try to keep that limited to a maximum of 9 links. That's about all that the human brain can process before they get just totally confused and overwhelmed. I even recommend having fewer than that, maybe 6 or 7 as a max. That's just my preference. Your secondary links should be relative to where you're at. So your secondary links are going to be, if your global nav is across the top, then your secondary nav links are usually either on the left or the right hand side in a vertical format. And so those are going to be different depending on where you're at on the site. If you're on the home page, those links might link to other sites or areas within that home area. If you're on an HR site, those secondary links are going to link to things, benefits and, vacation request forms, that kind of thing, things relative to the HR. So those will be relative to where you're at. Those will change depending on where you're at on your site. Active links should be highlighted. So the active link would be, if you're on the HR site, then the HR link in your global nav should be a different color or bold or different background color, just some visible indication to let you know where you're at. So your page titles should match your link names. And what I mean by that is that if user clicks on a link in your global nav to get to some place, that name should match your page title. So just so users aren't confused. If it's totally different, they might wonder, did I click the wrong link? And it just adds a little bit to their confusion. And then you should use breadcrumbs if you can. That just gives users a way to get back to where they came from and kind of more of an awareness of where they're at and how they got there. Homepage design tips, and really this is good advice for any kind of a landing page or any page really. It doesn't even have to be the home page, but they should attract attention using a good balance of images and text. But you also want to keep the content succinct and uncluttered, so you don't want to have too much text, too many images. You want to have a good balance, and also white space plays a role. You don't want to have everything all squished together. White space can go a long way in the look of a nice looking page. And you also want to try to place the most important content above the fold. And above the fold is a term that came from newspapers. Back in the day, you had your most important stories at the top of the first page because when it was folded and on the newsstand, you want everybody to see your most juicy stories. So in the web world, above the fold just means what you see on the screen before you have to scroll down to see more. You want to try to design for different screen sizes, and here I'm not talking about tablets or phones. I'm talking about just regular computer screen or a office projector. SharePoint out of the box isn't responsive by default, so it's not going to look good on tablets or phones. So I'm talking about computer screens here, and this figure may vary, but the typical minimum screen size you want to design for, in most cases I've found, is 1024 by 768. Now again, this really depends on where you work and the size of the projectors that you might have in your office rooms. The old style projectors, 1024 by 768, that's the resolution you're working with. And if you're going to be doing a lot of presentations of showing off your SharePoint site or giving trainings, then you want to make sure it looks good on that resolution. Now, if you have some of the new widescreen, awesome computers in your conference rooms, then that might be different. So you want to figure out what is your minimum screen size and design for that. You want to test it on all kinds of different screen resolutions. The goal is you want to avoid left-right scrolling at all costs. So you want to make sure it looks good on your minimum screen size without left-right scrolling. And just one other thing just to keep in mind, the fold will be in different places depending on your screen resolution. So just something to be aware of in the back of your mind. I've put together this list of things, and this is not an all-inclusive list, just some of the most common things that can make your users frustrated. And we've talked about some of these, inconsistent navigation, too many links across the top, active links aren't highlighted, so you're not sure where you're at. It might take too many mouse clicks to get where you want to go, or even worse, you just can't even find what you're looking for. The site could be cluttered, not a good balance between the text, images, and white space. Too many words on the page. There's nothing worse than just seeing a page full of text, like a home page where you just want to maybe glance and get the key information, and it's just there's so many words, you're going to lose people. Left-right scrolling is one of the worst things that you can encounter. Along with performance, you might not think of that as being a usability issue, more of a like an IT issue, but if the site is slow, that is extremely frustrating, and you're going to lose people. They're not going to come back to your site. If it's not evident whether your form was submitted successfully, you enter some information and click save, and you're taken to something you weren't expecting to see, or you're not given an indication that your form was even submitted, or it isn't clear what you're supposed to do or focus on. Once you get to a page, you're not sure what exactly you're supposed to do, and unclear error messages. And the SharePoint error messages can be pretty cryptic and not very helpful, and so that could be confusing. Now we're going to talk about some of the common usability issues that we see with the out-of-the-box SharePoint user interface. One of the first ones is the out-of-the-box default list views. They're not really that useful. Typically, especially if you create a custom list, what does that default view look like? there might be 15 columns and you've got all this data and it's sorted in the order it was entered and there's no grouping, no filtering, and it's hard to figure out what you're looking at. You can see the example here. There's all these columns. That's just very unpleasant to look at. It's not displayed in any kind of meaningful way. So the great thing about SharePoint is you can create your own views and sort and group and filter your data to your heart's content. And a lot of people don't know that you can change one of your views to be the default view so that when somebody clicks on the list, it's going to take them to that view, which will be much more helpful than just the out of the box all items view. The quick launch links that get created when you create new content areas are not intuitive. It typically just uses the list or the library name as the link name, and I prefer to use action words in my quick launch links to kind of describe what you can do rather than just say documents. Well, okay, that's not very intuitive. Maybe add a link that says view all documents and another one that says upload a document or add a new document. Just using more action words to describe, and we'll see that in the demo later, how we've revamped that quick launch to be a lot more intuitive. When you create a new subsite, by default, the navigation inheritance is set to no. So what does that mean? So you go to create a new subsite, and on the left screenshot there, you can see we're creating a new project site. You scroll down to the bottom of that page at the very bottom, and there's a section called Navigation Inheritance. Use the top link bar from the parent site. That is set to no by default. So what happens if you set that to no? Well, then you have just kind of branched this site away from all the other ones, and the only link you see at the top is the link to your new site. You lose your global navigation. Okay, so to get around that, you can simply set that to yes. You just have to be aware of it, and this is something I really don't like. Why by default would you want to branch every site you create? I'm not sure. Anyway, that's the default setting, and don't not to worry if you forget to set that. You can go back into the site settings after you've created it and change that. We'll see that in the demo as well. The page title navigation is kind of confusing. Especially when you get to pages where it looks like a breadcrumb. So it sort of looks like a breadcrumb, but it's not really a breadcrumb. It's really confusing. And on top of that, there aren't any breadcrumbs in SharePoint 2013 out of the box. They hid those from the master page in SharePoint 2013. You can of course go back and add those in, but you've got to update the master page, and if you want to change the way these page titles function, you'd have to change the master page or CSS. So unfortunately that's not something you could fix just real easy out of the box without updating a master page and or CSS. It's just something I wanted to point out and make you aware of. And then it's way too easy to create folders. So a lot of times companies will deploy SharePoint and they'll give each team a site and say, here you go, put your documents in it. Well, it's just way too easy to create folders and just mass upload everything from your shared drive. Well, there is a way to turn that off if you want to. It's enabled by default, but you can go into your list or library settings page and specify whether you want them to be able to even use folders or not. So you would just set that to no. All right, so let's go over some of the top usability tips that we will apply. And I've pulled out 10 of my tips. I do other presentations, and I think I've got one that is 25 usability tips or whatever. I've pulled out 10 here that we're going to talk about that we're actually going to, you'll see in action, or we will apply to our demo site. So first one, use function-driven navigation when possible. So use verbs instead of nouns. What can I do versus just some arbitrary list or library name. Number 2, avoid too much content on the home and landing pages. Again, you don't want to write a book. You don't want to have everything cluttered. You want spacing, white space, images, that kind of thing. only show relevant information to the user. So the user doesn't necessarily need to see everything that somebody else might see, or you might want to filter tasks, for example, and just show me my tasks, the ones that are assigned to me and not everyone else's. So don't show them any more than they need to see in order to get their job done. We talked about this one, change the default view on lists to a view that is more useful. And of course, you're going to have multiple views on your lists. Just pick the one that makes the most sense to the most users and have that be the default. Here's one that we didn't talk about, but it kind of makes sense. Use descriptive names for your content, for your lists and libraries, and especially documents and items. Don't use real cryptic names for your document names that only you understand. You can use descriptive words to describe what exactly it is so a person knows exactly what they're opening. Number 6, use metadata to organize your data, not folders. So we'll see an example of that in the demo as well. And these next ones have to do with forms. Number 7, hide unnecessary form data from your users. So if you have a SharePoint list and you have all this metadata, but some of it's for internal team use only, and you have other data that you want users to fill out, but not other fields, you can hide those fields from that create new form. And we'll show you that in the demo. Number 8, identify any required fields and other validation that you need to do on forms. There's nothing worse than a user enters all this data and they're not sure what's required, what's optional. Just make it obvious for them. Number 9, set the default values on forms when it makes sense. So if 99% of the time a certain category should be chosen, then default it to that. The user can change it, but the less typing or choosing they have to do, the better. And number 10, let users know that their form submission was successful. So out of the box, SharePoint just redirects you after you've entered a new item into a list, just redirects you back to that list. Well, it may not be clear that the form was submitted, and maybe you don't want users to go back to the list. Maybe you had taken the time to create a dashboard page, and that's where they click the button to add a new item, and you want to take them back there. But first, you want to give them an indication that their form submission was successful. You can actually create a page, a thank you page that says, thanks, we got your message, and then give them an option to click back to the home page. And we'll see an example of that in the demo as well. And speaking of demo, let's jump over to that right now. So here we are at our demo site. What I've done is created a top-level projects site collection, and then I have several project subsites below that. The first thing I want to show you is what we talked about earlier, is when you're creating a new subsite, how it defaults, once you enter all your name, your URL, the template type, and if you scroll down to the bottom, the very bottom, navigation inheritance, how it by default it says no for use top link from the parent site. So what happens when you do that, I'm going to go over to my Project X site. This is my before site, so this is everything that's wrong with it. You can see my global navigation, I only see a link to Project X. I don't have a way to get back to my project's home site or any of the other project sites that you see here in this global navigation. So how can you fix that? Well, it's pretty easy. If you set it up wrong in the first place, you can go into Site Settings, click on Top Link Bar under Look and Feel, and then you can just say Use Links from Parent. Click OK, and now you see I've got my global navigation up here. So that was pretty cool. We were able to fix that. The second thing I want to point out here is the quick launch on the left-hand side, how it's just not very intuitive. You have a home link, but then you have a link to documents, tasks, calendar, issue. It's just not real intuitive, doesn't give you any indication, any action words to say, hey, what can I do when I click this? If we look at our landing page, specifically the tasks list here and the issues list at the bottom, you'll see that this doesn't make a lot of sense looking at it. There's a lot of columns here, a lot of data. It's mixing data that's assigned to me versus Alice Payton. It's not very intuitive. It's not easy to understand this data. If we take a look at the default views on, say, the task list, again, it's just all this data not presented in any sort of meaningful way. Also back to the home page, you'll notice that we're using folders here in our documents library. And the problem with this is that I can't see any of my documents for one, but then I also don't know if I click through, I don't know if even documents exist or how many, or if there's different subfolders under that. For instance, project documentation has different folders for the different phases of the project, and I have to click through before I can even find what I'm looking for. And then even worse, I have to keep clicking back in my browser to get back to where I came from. Not intuitive, just not easy to work with documents at all in SharePoint using folders. The next thing I want to point out is that if you wanted to, for instance, create a new issue, I'm going to say add new item. If we just go with the default setup, if you have users that you want them to submit you an issue, well, they don't necessarily know what all of this data means. They open this and my first thought is, oh my goodness, I just want to let you know of a simple issue and I have to fill out all these fields. This is madness, right? So they have to literally have to create, website is down. Um, I, I don't even know who would I assign it to. I'll just leave that blank. Some of the, well, I might think this is a high priority, and I might add a little description. But again, the category related issues, comments, due date, I don't know if I even need to fill this in. And maybe I shouldn't, maybe I shouldn't fill this in. I want this fixed today, and I'm going to save it. Notice when I submitted that, where did it take me? It took me to this issues list. Well, I might not even want people, for one, to go to this list. If they got to the form from the home page, I probably want to redirect them back to the home page, or I might even want to redirect them to a temporary page first saying, hey, thank you, we got your request. Out of the box SharePoint doesn't do that, so this could be confusing. Okay, now I want to take you to my Project Y site, which I have duplicated from the Project X site, but then I've made some changes, which I think some of it is pretty apparent just looking at the page. I added this nice image over here. Nothing major, but it just gives a visual pop and makes it look a little more appealing. You'll notice my global navigation is set up properly, so no matter which project site I'm on, I can get directly back to the home page, or I can go directly to another project without having to figure out how to get there. I have organized my quick launch links and added additional links to be much more intuitive and to make more sense. So I've organized them by the different types of content, so project documents, project tasks, issues, etc. And then below each one of those, I'm using action words so that a person will know what they do if they click on that link. I want to add a new document, or I want to view all documents, or I want to create a new task, or view all tasks, or view my tasks. It's very obvious what content I am going to see or what I will be able to do when I click on this link. And on the landing page, aside from adding the image here, I've also redone my tasks and issues web parts. I've changed them, number one, fewer columns, so it's not so confusing. If I want more information on a task, I can click through it. And I've also filtered them just to show the tasks and issues that are assigned to me. So it's much more personalized to me, and it's what I would want to see. I might not be concerned looking at a glance, seeing what other people are working on. I want to see what I want to work on. I can always click through the task list to see what other people are working on. And speaking of that, if we just go ahead and click through, look at the project tasks, you'll notice I've changed the default view from the all columns and no sorting grouping and being very chaotic to one of the views that I've created that is grouping them by status. So what this allows me to do is, say if I'm a project manager, I can come in here and immediately see there's 3 tasks that aren't started, 1 in progress, 1 completed, 1 is waiting on someone else. I can see that within seconds of entering the page. So it's much more meaningful, much more intuitive. And if I go back to my home page once again, I wanted to point out the project documents. We're no longer using folders, but we're using metadata to group our data. So you can see here, and you can also see instantly, I have 4 documents under the project documentation, 1 statement of work, 3 status reports. I can see that without even expanding. And then if I want to expand, I can see my status reports, and if I make them descriptive, then I know exactly, hey, this is the week 2 status report. That's pretty obvious. So we're using very descriptive titles for our documents. I can also add additional metadata under project documentation. Remember, we had a second grouping of folder underneath of that. Well, I've created a separate metadata column for that called phase, and so I can, at a glance, I can see all my project documentation, and then I could even looks like it's already sorted for me, but I could even sort or even filter if I just want to see all the documents related to development for this project. And then of course you see here I can expand multiple doc types to see all my documents at once, whereas with folders I'm clicking in, clicking out, hitting the back button. So this is much more intuitive, easier to work with. I can instantly sort or filter my data to hone in on exactly the data I want. Now let's go into our project documents libraries settings page here quickly. We're going to click on library and then library settings up in the ribbon. And when I'm talking about metadata, really what I'm talking about are columns. So I've created a doc type column and a phase column for these libraries. You can create a new column and all different types of data here. The next thing I want to show you is some of the changes I have made to creating a new issue form. So let's click on Create New Issue. You remember on the old site, my form was much different looking than this. Let's go back to New Item here. Remember all these different fields, and it's kind of overwhelming and I don't know what I need to enter here. Well, I've greatly simplified the form here for users that are submitting issues. And I've broken it down into only 3 fields. So they must enter a title and then a description of their issue and a category. And so you'll notice I've made the first 2 fields required. They must enter a title and I want them to enter a description. Category is optional, but if they happen to know what it is, they can enter it. And then if you've got a bunch of sub-projects under here, and this is the particular project that we're working on right now, I could set that as a default value so the user doesn't even have to enter that, but I could change it if I wanted to. So that greatly simplifies the data that the user has to enter. They're less likely to get overwhelmed or frustrated. It's, hey, I just need to tell you what's wrong, choose a category, and I'm good to go. Now I also want to show you what happens when I click Save. Remember what happened on the other list? It just took you right back to the issues list, which just lists a bunch of data that's not very meaningful to the user. Now if I click Save, it's going to, hey, tell me, thank you, your form was successfully submitted. You will hear from someone on our team within 48 business hours. Now, this is a page that I created in a wiki page library, and you can put anything here you want, whatever message you want to tell the user to assure them that you've received it and you're going to get back with them. And I even added a hyperlink on here to take them back to the home page of my site. So you're probably wondering how I was able to hide those fields from the form. So I did it using content types. And I'm going to go into site settings here, go into site content types and show you what I did. And I don't want this lesson to be a whole thing on content types. I mean, this is kind of a complicated thing, but hopefully you can at least follow along and see how it's set up. So I created a new custom content type called Create New Issue. and I inherited from the parent issue content type. So what that does is it pulls in all the fields that are already associated to an issue. So your title assigned to issue status priority. So these are all of the fields that you were seeing on this old form here in our old site. These are all the fields you were seeing. And then what I did was for each field that I don't want to show up on my new form, I set it to hidden. So you can click on each one of these, and it's normally set to optional. I just set it to hidden, so it means it will not appear in forms. So that's what I've done with each one of these that I wanted to be hidden. I went here and hid them. Also, there are certain fields that I want it to be required. Now, title is always required by default, but I also came in here and set, for example, my description field. I set that to required because I want users to enter that as well. Okay, now that I have my content type created, I need to add it to my issues list. So I need to come to my list, and list settings in the ribbon. The first thing I'll need to do is go to advanced settings because by default content types are not enabled. So I would need to set that to yes, which I've already done. The second thing I would do then is I would go add from existing site content types. And what I would do is add my issues content type. Now since it's already added to my list, I don't see it here, so it's not going to show up, but I've already done that. And you can see my create new issue content type is there. The next thing I did was change new button order and default content type, and I just made sure that they're both visible, but I put my create new content or my create new issue as position 1 from the top. What that does is if I go back to my list and if I go to items in new item, I see both of my content types here. So if I just click on my regular issue content type, here's where I see my traditional list. But if I go back and I click on create new issue, well then here is my abbreviated form because it's using that content type with the other fields hidden. So if I'm on the project team and I know all that information, want to go ahead and enter that, I could choose the other content type and enter all that information at once. But if this is a form that I'm presenting to users who don't know that information or I don't want them to see it, then I can provide them the link to this. And so that's what I have done. I've created my hyperlink when I say create new issue, and I'm pointing it to the create new issue content type that we created. And the last thing I want to show you is how I created the redirect to the thank you page. Well, the first thing I'll do, let's go to site contents. I created a wiki pages library, and there's one page in there. It's this thank you page. It's the page that you saw when we submitted the form, and if we edit it, it's just text and a hyperlink. I inserted a link here and linked it back to the home page. So very simple, takes minutes to create. Stop editing. So that's pretty simple, but the real question is how do I get my form to redirect to that after I've entered my data and submitted it? So SharePoint has this thing, it's called a source parameter that you can put on the end of any SharePoint URL. And I've got this in WordPad here, so hopefully let's make this a little bigger. Hopefully you can see this. So first of all, I've captured what is my relative URL to my thank you page. And I can get that from the address bar up here. The relative URL just means everything after your root URL. So here's my relative URL. Here is my link to my create a new issue page. And so what I've done is at the end of that, I've added, you see highlighted in yellow, I've added ampersand source equals, and then I've appended my relative URL. So if we look at create new issue, and it actually does a redirect to this page, but you can see up here, and it also URL encodes my hyperlink here, my link, but you can see that it's up there. And so what that source parameter does is anytime you submit a form, SharePoint looks at that URL in that parameter and redirects to that. So it's just it's an easy trick, pretty simple, Not a lot of people know about it, and it's very powerful, and so I wanted to bring awareness to that. And also, it greatly enhances the usability of your user experience when your users are submitting forms. Okay, so now I want to jump back over to my slides. Just one second here. So I hope you can see how just making a few quick, simple changes can enhance the usability of your SharePoint site. And here's just a recap screenshot again here of our home page before. Our global navigation was missing. Quick launch is not intuitive. Our tasks and our issues lists were not personalized to just show me my relative information, and there's too much data to make sense of, and it's using folders. If we look at our page afterwards, we fixed that global nav issue, so now our global navigation is consistent. We've updated our quick launch to be much more descriptive using action words and making it very clear and evident what will happen if you click that link. For our tasks and issues list, we're showing just my tasks, so what's relevant to me, fewer columns so it's less cluttered, and if I want to see more information I can click through. And also we're not using folders, we're using metadata instead to group and categorize our data, which allows us to do things like grouping, filtering, sorting, just a much better experience. And then we've added our nice image there to give a little visual pop. And if we take a look at our new issue form before and after, before you see we had all of these extra fields, user is kind of overwhelmed, not sure what they need to fill out, confused. After, we've greatly condensed the number of fields that we're seeing, making it easier on the user, and then we redirect them to a thank you page afterwards saying that their form was successfully submitted, also making sure all the required fields are marked, and so it's just a much better experience for the user. I'd like to thank you so much for attending my session. It's really appreciated. I know there's a lot of other great sessions out there right now, and the slides and the video recording will be posted to my website at wendy-neal.com. Once again, thank you so much for watching.